This is one of the most chilling criminal cases in American history. Over the span of 16 years, the killer was responsible for over 400 deaths. What was the killer's motive, and how did he manage to evade the law for so long? What methods did the killer use to carry out such a large-scale crime? The story takes place in an ordinary hospital in New Jersey. The female lead, Amy, is a night shift nurse at the hospital's emergency center. Amy is diligent at work and kind to others. She is a true, good nurse in every sense. One early morning after a busy overnight shift, Amy was about to go home. Suddenly, she felt short of breath and nearly collapsed. She had to sit in the staff lounge for quite a while before she could recover a bit. It turns out Amy had recently been diagnosed with a heart condition and needed surgery as soon as possible, but as a financially struggling single mother raising 2 young daughters on her own, she had no means to afford the expensive operation. Fortunately, as long as she worked at this hospital for a full year, she would qualify for employee medical insurance and paid sick leave. Amy had already worked there for 8 months. If she could grit her teeth and hang on for just 4 more months, she'd have both the time and money to get the surgery she needed. However, according to hospital policy, Amy couldn't let the administration know about her illness, otherwise, she would certainly be dismissed early. So she endured the pain in silence, carefully hiding her condition from her colleagues. Not long after, a new male nurse named Charles joined the emergency center. He had just transferred from another hospital. Not only was he experienced, but he also had a great reputation in the industry. Like Amy, he was assigned to care for the hospital's night shift patients. As they worked together, Amy noticed that Charles was meticulous in his duties and gentle with others, a very suitable work partner. Coincidentally, Charles had also gone through a failed marriage and had 2 young daughters. He transferred to this hospital mainly to be closer to his ex-wife's home so that he could more easily visit his daughters, who were living with their mother. With a strong professional rapport and shared personal experiences, Amy quickly came to see Charles as a confidant. They became close friends who could talk about anything. One night, the emergency center received a patient who was on the verge of death. Amy and her colleagues took turns performing CPR for over half an hour before they finally snatched the patient back from the clutches of death. The intense emergency work caused Amy, who suffers from a heart condition, to nearly faint.
Hey, Amy. It's okay.
Attentive as ever, Charles noticed something was wrong. After some concerned questioning, Amy had no choice but to confess her heart condition to him. Upon learning the truth, Charles not only promised to keep her secret, but also secretly retrieved a heart medication pill from the hospital's automated dispensing machine and gave it to Amy. Stealing medication, this was clearly a violation. If the hospital found out, Charles would definitely be fired. Amy initially wanted to refuse his kind gesture, but Charles reassured her and insisted she take the pill, saying the hospital would never trace the transaction back to him. It turns out Charles had discovered a bug in the automated dispensing system. Normally, when medical staff log in and select a medication, the machine displays 2 buttons, accept and cancel. Pressing accept dispenses the medication, cancel returns to the selection screen. But Charles discovered that if one stays on the accept-cancel screen long enough, the machine will automatically dispense the previously selected medication. Then, after taking the medication, if the operator taps cancel, the machine won't log that the medication was dispensed. Long story short, my friends, Charles had used this trick to get the pill for Amy, and it wouldn't show up in the system at all. To further comfort Amy, Charles added that even if his actions were discovered, it didn't matter, because compared to hospital rules and regulations, her health and life were far more important. His words deeply moved Amy, and their trust in each other grew even stronger. From then on, whenever they worked the night shift together, Charles always took on more responsibilities to prevent Amy from overexerting herself. Sometimes, Charles even came to Amy's home to help care for her 2 daughters, greatly easing the burden of her daily life. One evening, as Amy arrived at work, she was met with some unfortunate news. An elderly woman who had been rushed in previously due to a penicillin allergy had suddenly taken a turn for the worse during the day and passed away. Amy was shocked upon hearing this. The old woman's condition had clearly been improving since the night before. How could she suddenly die? Although she felt suspicious, Amy didn't think too much of it. After all, the woman was 77 years old and a sudden decline in health wasn't out of the question. However, in the 7th week after the woman's death, 2 police officers suddenly arrived at the hospital, saying they were assisting the hospital in investigating the cause of her death. It turns out that while reviewing death cases across various hospitals, the local health department found suspicious circumstances surrounding the elderly woman's death. They could not rule out the possibility of homicide, so they requested the hospital to conduct a thorough investigation. To prevent any internal cover-up by the hospital, the health department specifically requested that the police be involved in the investigation as well. The two officers assigned to the case were Detective Danny and his partner, Tim. The hospital's upper management promptly reported their internal findings to the two detectives. According to the hospital's investigation, after questioning relevant staff and reviewing medical records, they concluded that the elderly woman had died of natural causes with no evidence of foul play. However, Danny remained suspicious. To him, it was a very straightforward case, yet the hospital had taken 7 full weeks to produce their findings. It seemed more like they were intentionally stalling for time. The problem now was that the woman's body had already been cremated by her family, and the hospital had only provided the police with a few pages of blood test results and nursing notes. With no medical knowledge at all, Danny and Tim couldn't uncover anything from the documents. Left with no better options, they decided to question the emergency department staff one by one. But because hospital executives were present during all the interviews, even if any of the staff had noticed something unusual, they didn't dare speak openly to the police. So, despite a full day of effort, Danny and Tim got nothing useful. When it was Amy's turn to be interviewed, the hospital management had to step away for a few minutes. Danny took the opportunity to ask Amy to help review the deceased's blood test report. Amy immediately spotted a problem. The insulin level in the woman's blood was far higher than the level of C-peptide. Normally, insulin and C-peptide come from the same source in the body and appear in roughly equal proportions. In other words, a person's insulin levels should generally match their C-peptide levels. The only explanation for such a discrepancy would be that the person had been injected with external insulin, but the woman had no history of diabetes and had no need for insulin at all. This meant she most likely died from an insulin overdose. In other words, it was a case of murder. Amy's statement confirmed Danny's previous suspicion. Danny and Tim then began a more thorough review of all emergency room personnel. At this point, one male nurse with a criminal record caught their attention, none other than Charles, who had only recently joined the staff and was close to Amy. It turned out that 8 years ago, Charles had been arrested for harassing a hospital colleague and illegally breaking into her home. He had only escaped jail time because the victim eventually dropped the charges to avoid further conflict. That wasn't all. Over the past 16 years, Charles had worked at 9 different hospitals. In some of them, he had stayed only a few months. The longest he had stayed at any one hospital was just a few years. For a nurse, such frequent job changes were clearly unusual. What was even more suspicious was that when the police contacted these 9 hospitals to inquire about Charles's employment history and reasons for leaving, each hospital was evasive. They all refused to cooperate with the investigation, citing employee privacy protection. With the investigation stalling, Danny and Tim thought once again of Amy, who frequently worked night shifts with Charles. When they visited her privately, they came straight out and voiced their suspicions about Charles. But Amy immediately dismissed the detectives' concerns. In her view, Charles had over a decade of nursing experience. There was no way he would make the rookie mistake of injecting a patient with a lethal dose of insulin. Moreover, Charles had always been kind and friendly. Amy simply couldn't believe he would murder a complete stranger for no reason. Besides, the elderly woman had died during the day, and Charles only worked night shifts. So Amy was firmly convinced that the woman's death had nothing to do with Charles. However, just a few days later, another death occurred at the hospital. And this time, even Amy couldn't help but start to doubt Charles. The victim this time was a young mother who had been severely injured in a car accident and was admitted to the emergency center. After a whole night of effort by the medical team, the young mother had made it through the danger. But to everyone's shock, her condition suddenly deteriorated the following night, and she died. When Amy reviewed the blood test report, she discovered that the young mother had also been injected with an excessive amount of insulin. 2 patients dying from insulin overdoses in such a short time clearly indicated foul play. And what made Amy even more uneasy was a chance encounter outside the hospital with a former female classmate, someone who had once worked at the same hospital as Charles. This classmate revealed something shocking. At her hospital, there had also been multiple cases of deaths caused by insulin overdoses. An internal investigation team at the time had found several intravenous saline bags in the medication room that had tiny puncture marks in them. Lab analysis showed those bags contained abnormally high levels of insulin. At first, no one suspected Charles. But shortly after the incidents, Charles suddenly resigned. And after his departure, the hospital's patient mortality rate dropped significantly. There were no more cases of insulin overdose deaths. This revelation chilled Amy to the bone. She rushed back to the hospital and carefully inspected all the intravenous bags in the medication room. Sure enough, she found several bags with unexplained needle marks. After testing, these bags were confirmed to contain excessive amounts of insulin. The puncture holes on the intravenous saline bags were extremely tiny. If you didn't examine them closely, you wouldn't notice anything unusual. Amy was utterly shocked. She immediately removed all the suspicious saline bags, then rushed to the police station to inform Danny and Tim of the situation. Amy suspected that Charles had been exploiting the bug in the automated medication dispenser to steal large quantities of insulin, which he then randomly injected into patients' saline bags. Since the insulin used in this hospital was a colorless, transparent liquid, it could easily blend with the saline solution, making it nearly impossible to detect. That way, even if Charles wasn't present during the injection, he could still kill patients through the hands of other unsuspecting nurses. The problem now was that these were only Amy's suspicions. The police didn't yet have any solid evidence to charge Charles. Amy then thought of the recently deceased young mother. With the family's consent, the police performed an autopsy and found that her body did indeed contain an excessive amount of insulin. At the same time, Amy found a chance to secretly access Charles's operation records from the medication dispenser. The records showed that Charles had repeatedly selected insulin in amounts far exceeding normal usage, only to then press the cancel button afterward. This was clear evidence of him exploiting the system bug to steal medication. However, that alone wasn't sufficient for a formal accusation, because legitimate cancellations by staff would also leave the same kind of record. While Danny and Tim were stuck, unsure how to catch Charles red-handed, the hospital administration suddenly found a trivial excuse and fired Charles. Clearly, the hospital had also noticed something was off with Charles, but in order to distance themselves from the issue, they chose to simply kick him out and avoid potential damage to their reputation and business once the matter became public. In fact, the reason the 9 other hospitals where Charles had previously worked refused to talk to the police was also driven by business interests. Some hospital administrators were even so eager to get rid of this plague that they personally wrote Charles recommendation letters to help him find jobs elsewhere. Because of this, even though Charles had committed terrible crimes, he was always able to escape exposure and again find new jobs where he could continue his killing spree. Determined to stop this monster from harming anyone else, Amy decided to cooperate with the police and try to extract a confession from Charles. A few days later, she met up with Charles at a restaurant wearing a hidden wire. At that moment, Charles had no suspicion of Amy. He calmly told her that he had already found a new job and would soon be working at another hospital. Amy pretended to be composed and brought up the recent deaths at their hospital. She bluntly said that after Charles's resignation, rumors had spread among the staff that the 2 deaths were caused by Charles himself. Amy said she hoped Charles could tell her the truth and explain what had driven him to do such a thing. Charles immediately sensed that Amy was testing him. The trust in his eyes quickly turned into disappointment and anger. He didn't answer Amy's questions, he simply got up and prepared to leave the restaurant. Realizing the plan had failed, Danny and Tim had no choice but to temporarily detain Charles. According to the law, in the absence of solid evidence, the police could only detain a suspect for 48 hours. This means that if Charles refuses to confess during this time, Danny and Tim will have no choice but to let him go. To break Charles's silence, the 2 detectives took turns questioning him with intense pressure. But Charles remained highly uncooperative.
You can. You gotta do this. I know you can.
As the interrogation dragged on, Charles began to get more agitated. He vented his frustrations hysterically, revealing terrifying, perverse traits.
I can't!
2 hours later.
I can't!
However, after venting his emotions, Charles refused to say another word. In desperation, Danny and Tim had no choice but to call Amy in again to assist with the questioning. This time, Amy didn't use any verbal tricks. She simply asked Danny to remove Charles's handcuffs, then took off her own coat and draped it over Charles, who was shivering in his thin clothes. She sincerely apologized to him. Amy said that she shouldn't have used Charles's trust to help the police trap him into a confession. After apologizing, Amy expressed her gratitude. She believed that all of Charles's help to her in life and work had been genuine. She couldn't understand how a kind person could commit such horrific acts. Finally, as a friend, Amy asked Charles to tell the truth. Perhaps it was Amy's gentle approach that moved Charles, or maybe the years of attempted killings had left Charles exhausted. He ultimately confessed to the murders and named 29 of his victims. But according to the police's later investigations and estimations, the number of Charles's victims could have exceeded 400. When asked why he did it, his answer was vague and disturbing.
They didn't stop me.
This haunting statement exposes a deeper flaw, not just in one man, but in the systems that enabled him. hospitals that quietly dismissed red flags to avoid liability, institutions that failed to protect the very lives they vowed to care for. It reminds us that compassion without courage can become complicity, and that sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is simply speak the truth. To all the real good nurses out there who heal, protect, and speak up, this story is a reminder of your power and your responsibility.